Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbity Bobbity Books. My name is Ellie and this is going to be my June/July reading wrap up. So I'm a bit behind with filming my reading wrap up. It came to the end of June and I felt like I just didn't really have enough books to film a full wrap up video for the end of that month. So I've postponed it, but now it's mid-July. I feel like I do actually have quite a few books to go through today. So I thought I would film a wrap up now. So it's going to be a discussion about all of the books that I read in June, plus a few extra ones that I've read in July. I hope that's okay. But yes, I do have quite a few books to chat you through today, so I'm really excited to begin. So let's just get stuck in. So the first book I want to briefly mention is one that I've actually soft DNF'd. So I've put this one down for now, but it's not a forever put down. It's just let's put that aside for now and reach for it another time, because I just felt like it wasn't what I was expecting and it just wasn't really working for me at the time. And that book is actually Lost in the Garden by Adam S. Leslie, and I'm really sad that I didn't gel with this one right away, because this is actually one of my most anticipated releases for this year. I was so excited by the premise for this one and I love the cover, and I'm really into folk horror at the moment, and this is a folk horror story, so I really thought this was going to be one that I was going to love, but I just didn't quite expect the writing style for this one. This has a style of writing that comes across quite pretentious to me, and it's very strange, it's very abstract, and it just wasn't quite what I was wanting at the time. My brain just wasn't really processing the story, so I feel like to give this book a fair chance it was better for me to put it aside, and then I can reach for it when I have a better expectation, when I go into it knowing what it's going to be like, and I feel like that's going to be the best way for me to enjoy this story. So yes, I have put it down for now, but I will be picking it up at some point in the future, especially because I got this comment on my video, and that just makes me even more intrigued to read this story, because it sounds actually like it's going to be really entertaining. So yeah, what is this one actually about? So this is a folk horror and it's about three girls, Heather, Rachel and Antonia, and they are going to this place called Almonby, and it says on the back, Heather needs to find her boyfriend who, like so many, went and never came back. Rachel has a mysterious package to deliver and her life depends on it, and Antonia, poor love-struck Antonia, just wants the chance to spend the day with Heather. So they set off through the idyllic yet perilous English countryside in which nature thrives in abundance and summer lasts forever. And as they travel through ever-shifting geography and encounter strange voices in the fizz of shortwave radio, the harder it becomes to tell friend from foe. And I'm just going to read you literally the first page just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that the writing style is quite overwritten and a little bit pretentious. Ice cream van chimes elicit a synesthetic Pavlovian response. The sound tastes of vanilla, it tastes of chocolate flake and neon red spirals of strawberry sauce. It tastes of all the myriad possibilities illustrated in lurid colour beside the serving hatch. A miniature church cast in pinks and yellows and powder blues, its oversaturated bells calling the children of the parish to worship. The communion wafer, the communion soft whip ice cream, the blessed chocolate flake rearing from its icy white hillock like the pole of the holy crucifix, waiting for the crossbeam, waiting in giddy anticipation to receive the condemned Christ in his martyrdom. And the swirl of strawberry sauce right at the very end, representing the blood of our Lord swirling down the hill of Golgotha. Do you see what I mean? I feel like this book is going to take a certain amount of brain power and I just wasn't feeling it at the time, but I will be giving it another go in the future. Okay, so moving on to the first book that I actually did read and complete in June, and that is actually a manga called Hat AER. This is the first volume in a series and I really enjoyed this one. This is a very cozy manga and it follows our main character, who is a girl called Coco, and she's always wanted to be a witch, but she lives in a world where she believed that witches had to have innate magical abilities, and so she thought that her dream was out of her reach because she is just an ordinary girl. But then one day she spies a witch doing a magic spell and she realizes that they don't use a magic wand, they don't kind of use power in the way that you might imagine. They actually draw magic, so they use a pen and paper to draw their spells. And so Coco decides to give it a go for herself, and she copies some symbols out of this magic book that she received under mysterious circumstances, and she accidentally casts a really dangerous spell. And from there she basically gets whisked away by this mysterious figure to this magic school where she can learn to hone her craft, she can learn to use magic safely, and hopefully to undo some of the damage that she accidentally created. And it kind of takes off from there really, and I just love the art style in this manga. I liked the story, I found it quite a comforting read. It does have quite a lot of well-used tropes in it. We do have our main character who is ordinary, who is kind of thrust into this magic school without any prior knowledge of magic, but she has this kind of like innate ability. And we also have this roommate who's pretty antagonistic and quite jealous because they have been studying magic for a long time and they don't understand why Coco deserves a place in this magic school, and so they butt heads a little bit. So there are some tropes in there. It's not the most unique story, but I did still have a fun time with this one, and I really love the idea of using artwork as a form of magic and using a pen and drawing symbols as your way of performing spells. I just think that's quite a unique idea and I just really enjoyed it. So yeah, I had a very cozy time reading this book and would recommend it to you if you're looking for something fun and if you're looking for something kind of comforting and cozy. The next book that I read in June was Diola, written by Jennifer Thorne. So this is a horror book and it follows our main character Anna, who is a woman in her 30s, and she is going on a family vacation to Tuscany. So she goes along to this villa in Tuscany, and basically as tensions rise within their family, so too do strange things start to happen in the villa. So, you know, food starts to go mouldy within hours, they start to hear strange things, and they have strange nightmares, and they start to experience lapses in their memory, and just all of this weird stuff starts happening. And I didn't get on with this one as much as I was hoping to, unfortunately. To me, this one read much more like a thriller than a gothic horror, which I feel like is something that the cover suggests. Like, I feel like how haunting and gothic this cover is gave me a certain expectation, and I just wasn't expecting so much family drama, because that was definitely the focus within this story, because the family is so toxic, and honestly most of the book is focusing on them sort of bickering and the tensions within the family. And a big theme is, you know, how the family treat Anna as our main character, because yes, Anna is incredibly irritating. She's not the nicest person, but she does get treated absolutely terribly by her family, so you kind of can't help but feel a little bit sorry for her, because the family use her as a scapegoat. They basically blame her for anything and everything that goes wrong, including when things start to go a bit weird in this villa in Tuscany, and it's always Anna's fault, and they kind of use her a bit like an emotional punching bag, and it was just so frustrating to read about. And I just don't particularly enjoy stories like that. Like, I'm not particularly interested in reading about toxic family dynamics and things, so it just wasn't really what I was expecting. There is a little bit of a mystery in here to keep you hooked. Our main character is basically trying to find out what on earth is going on with this villa and why it seems to be doing strange things to their family. And yeah, the only thing I would say is that kind of ends in a very unsatisfactory way, because our main character spends a decent amount of time going and interviewing locals and trying to gather information about the villa, but then the whole mystery is kind of solved by a quick Google search at the end of the book, and that just felt very sort of anticlimactic to me. And so yeah, I just feel like this just wasn't what I was expecting. It's not particularly my kind of writing style. Like I say, it just felt more like a sort of thriller in tone, and I prefer sort of stories that have a little bit more gothic style to the writing, and that's just what I was expecting from looking at this cover. So again, it's my own fault really for going in with a certain expectation, but I feel like you always do when you pick up a new book. It's hard not to when you read the title, when you look at the cover, when you read the blurb. So yeah, unfortunately this one didn't quite work for me, which is a shame. Okay, so the next book that I read was Women's Law, 4,000 Years of Sirens, Serpents and Succubi by Sarah Clegg. I don't actually have the physical copy with me because I've already lent it out to a friend, but I'll put a picture on the screen for you. But yeah, this is such an interesting non-fiction book in my opinion. I really enjoyed this story, and it's kind of exactly what it says in the title really. It's tracing the history of these creatures through a feminist perspective, and it's summarised quite nicely on Goodreads. There's like a line, a quote at the top of the Goodreads summary, which says, "This is the history of a demonic tradition that was stolen from women and then won back again." And it's honestly just so interesting. This traces these creatures back to their earliest incarnations, when they were actually demons that were worshipped by women, often because they were believed to be involved in difficult pregnancies and difficult childbirth and also infant mortality. So the women would sort of do these rituals and these spells to try and cast out these demons because they were trying to protect themselves. And I think that that's part of the reason why they stayed so popular throughout the years and so prevalent throughout history. And then it goes on to discuss about how these creatures were changed and adopted by a male-centered society before being claimed back in the 20th century and sort of turned into a symbol of women's liberation. So it's such a fascinating look at kind of the journey of these creatures, where they stemmed from, how they were changed and manipulated over the years, and how they were reclaimed by women. And I just loved it. I thought it was so fascinating. It's such an interesting perspective to look at these creatures from, and I learned so much that I didn't know. So it's now inspired me to go off and read a little bit more about these creatures, because I feel like this was a great starting point, but there is so much more that I'm sure you can learn from these creatures. So yeah, I highly recommend this one. I also talk about it a little bit more in detail in my mermaid reading vlog, so if you want to hear me talking a bit more about this book, then I will link that one down below if you're interested. But yeah, highly recommend. The next book is another one that I read for my mermaid reading vlog, and that is Mermaids, The Myths, Legends and Lore by Skye Alexander. This is another non-fiction book, and it's a very pretty book. I love the cover, and it's got some gorgeous illustrations and things throughout. It's got some pictures and things, so it's a very pleasant sort of reading experience going through this one. But I will say that it is very vague and it is very brief, so I would only really recommend this one to you if you are a complete beginner and you don't really know anything about mermaids, and if you're wanting to sort of dip your toes in, because for me I found it to be quite lacking and quite simplistic. It also has quite a Western focus, so while it does talk about mermaids in different cultures across the world, the majority of it is looking at sort of European cultures and things like that. So yeah, it's a very pretty and aesthetically pleasing book. It's easy to read, and you know, it could be a nice place to begin if you're new to finding out about these creatures. But for me, I found it to be a little bit too sort of vague and a bit too brief really for my tastes. So I think after reading such a interesting non-fiction with the Sarah Clegg book, this one felt a little bit flat for me, which is a shame. But yeah, a very pretty book to have in my collection anyway. The next book that I read was Lore by Tim McGregor. This is actually a mermaid horror book, and it's a novella, so it's very short, easy to read, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. This was so gripping and so intense, and I just loved it. It's set in a fishing village, and we follow the perspective of a teenage boy and his experiences when a mermaid shows up in the bay, and how the presence of this creature affects the town and how it kind of descends into chaos, really. And this was so well paced, and it had some really great action sequences in there as well. I don't really want to give you any spoilers because it's such a short book, so I'll just read you a little bit from the blurb. So it says, when a new god drifts into the bay, the men folk fear nothing as they reach for their spears, but capturing her may be their last act of reckless bravado. Her very presence brings dissent and madness. Her voice threatens to tear the starving, angry community apart. Setting a siege of relentless horror against the backdrop of brine and blood, law blurs the line between natural disaster and self-destruction. Things that I loved about this story were the pacing was fantastic, but also the atmosphere. You could practically taste the salt in the air and hear the sound of the waves. It was so drenched in the ocean. The sea is so important to this community. All of the men are fishermen, basically. You know, fish and you know, sea creatures are their main source of food, and so just everything sort of was seeped in the sea, and it was incredibly atmospheric. And again, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but I will say that a big theme in this book is the mistreatment of women, because this is set in a misogynist society where women were expected to be married off to husbands, often against their will, and their sole purpose in life in this society is to serve their husbands, to be housewives and to stay at home. And it kind of talks a little bit about that, so if you like those kinds of themes, then I would recommend this book. But yeah, it kept me hooked from beginning to end, and it just escalated and escalated as tensions built into this really explosive and violent ending. So yeah, it was incredibly gripping, and I had such a fun time with this one. The next book that I read was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. So I have been meaning to read this one for such a long time. I feel like this is such a booktube darling. So many people have read this book and have raved about it. It's had such high praises, and I think because of that I've been a little bit put off to pick it up, because I've been a bit intimidated by it and just worried that I won't enjoy it as much as everyone else seems to. But I finally bit the bullet and I finally read this book, and I can see why it is so popular, because it is incredibly beautifully written. If you don't know what this book is about, it's basically a retelling of the Trojan War, but it's told from the perspective of Patroclus, and it's focusing in on his relationship with Achilles. So it's essentially a very beautiful and tragic love story. And I feel like most people know how that story ends. So I think the whole time you're reading this, you know that it's not necessarily going to end happily, and that kind of adds to this feeling of sadness, I suppose, as you're reading along through the story. So yeah, I enjoyed the writing style in this book. It's very, very beautifully written, and I loved the first half of this story, and watching Patroclus and Achilles when they first met, how they formed this beautiful friendship, and how they spent time together through the years, and how they grew up together, and how they slowly started to develop romantic feelings towards each other. I just thought that was so beautifully done. I really enjoyed seeing that sort of characterization, really, and seeing their romance blossom, really. I thought it was so gentle and so beautiful to watch. But this might be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I did actually start to lose a little bit of interest towards the second half of this book, and I think that's just because I'm not a particularly big fan of like action scenes, and so when we got to some of the sort of battles and the war side of things, I actually glazed over a little bit, which is probably the opposite of most people. I'm sure most people would find those things to be really exciting, whereas I just sort of started to lose a little bit of interest, which is interesting. But yeah, I also know that a lot of people were incredibly sort of moved and felt very emotional by the end of the story, and I actually didn't feel as moved as I thought I was going to, and I think that's in part because I had this expectation. I've heard so many people saying that they were really upset by the ending and, you know, they can't stop thinking about it, and so I kind of put pressure on the book to deliver that, and I actually didn't really feel as emotional as I thought I was going to by the end of this book. But I also, strangely, felt more emotional about the middle of this book, and when we saw Achilles turn from this young man into this prophesized war hero. I thought that that transition was actually much more emotional and upsetting than the ending of the story, if that makes sense. I really thought it was sad watching him sort of lose his innocence in a way and sort of give up so much to become this war hero. So yeah, that's what got to me about this story more so than the ending, which is strange. But yes, I also just want to say that I couldn't help but think about what's it called? The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, because that is also a Trojan War retelling, but it's very, very different. And The Silence of the Girls is the story of the women, sort of untold story of the women in the Trojan War, and that, for me, was much more emotional and much more difficult to read than this story, and I couldn't help comparing the two. And there's also a character called Briseis who appears in both of the stories because she is an important figure in this story of Achilles and Patroclus, and I just found it very strange seeing her in this book after reading her in The Silence of the Girls, because her story in The Silence of the Girls is just so tragic and so heartbreaking, and I couldn't help but project that onto the character in this story. And so I found it quite difficult to see her in this story as portrayed as being kind of like happy and you know, to be, I don't know what the word is, but to see her seeming to be okay, I suppose. But I am very much aware that this isn't her story. This is the story of Patroclus and Achilles, and it's also Patroclus's perspective, so we don't really know what's going on in Briseis's head. But I couldn't help but just think about that other book basically when I was reading this one, and I know that she's a fictional character and the authors can write her in whatever way they want for the story. I'm going on a rant now, but basically I did really enjoy this book, by the way, and I can see why it's so popular, but I would recommend to you to read The Silence of the Girls if you're wanting something that is incredibly harrowing. Forget the romance, but if you want something that doesn't shy away from the real horrors of war, I would recommend that other book, although do be careful of trigger warnings because my goodness is that book difficult to read sometimes. But yes, I am glad to have finally read this book, and I'm glad that I did enjoy it. The next story that I read was The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a classic fairy tale and it's one that I haven't read before, and I did really enjoy my time with it. It's a very brief story and it's also very different from the Disney adaptation, which is the story that I'm most familiar with, and I was surprised to see how dark this story was and how different it was to that version. So in this story we follow the Little Mermaid. She doesn't have a name, she's just referred to as the Little Mermaid, and she has always wanted to go to the surface, to go above water, but her main goal in this story is to get a soul, because in this world mermaids don't have souls, so that means that when they die they just turn into sea foam and that's the end of their life, whereas humans have souls, so when they die they can kind of go and have eternal life up in the stars, and the only way for a mermaid to get a soul is to have a human fall in love with them and to love them so much that they will actually share their soul with them. And so that is actually the Little Mermaid's goal in this story, and so she goes and she meets the prince and she falls in love with him and she makes a deal with the sea witch so that she can have legs, but that comes with some pretty severe consequences. Her tongue is cut out so she can't speak, she's mute, and also she is in chronic pain. Basically having your fin turned into legs is very painful, and it means that every time she walks it's like she's walking on knives, which is just so horrible. And yeah, it's a pretty tragic story. It's not the happy ending that you might be expecting. There's quite a few differences to the Disney adaptation which I was interested to see. So yeah, a very interesting reading experience, and I'm definitely glad that I have now read the original story. Okay, so I think the final book that I have to talk to you about today is From Below by Darcy Coates. So this is a horror book, and it follows a dive team who are investigating this sunken wreck, this shipwreck, for a documentary that they're filming. And it's set in two timelines. So we have the past timeline, which is set 60 years prior, where we're following the crew on board this ship, which is called the SS Arcadia, and it's in the days leading up to the ship's sinking. So we're slowly finding out what went down on the ship and what occurred before it sank. And then we have the present day timeline when we're following our main character Cove and her dive team as they are going down to explore this wreck, and they're trying to piece together clues as to what happened and why the ship veered off course and why it eventually sank. And yeah, this was an interesting one. There's lots of things that I liked about it. So I really enjoy stories that are set underwater that involve diving, because I personally think that that is really terrifying, and I enjoyed how Darcy Coates included the real fears and the real dangers of deep sea diving within this story. So she talked a little bit about, you know, oxygen levels, about the bends and, you know, pressure sickness, but also about nitrogen narcosis and all of those things, which I think are terrifying in and of themselves, regardless of any other horrors from below that we might discover. So I really liked that she did a bit of research and that she included all of those technicalities within this story. I also liked how short the chapters were, because it kept you flicking the pages, and each chapter tended to end on a little bit of a cliffhanger to kind of keep you hooked. But I will say I do think this book was way too long. This book is like 460 something pages, which is very long for a horror novel, and I do feel like the pacing was really off. It started to feel very repetitive, and I just lost momentum with this story, particularly with the present day timeline, because they went on multiple dives and each dive kind of was very similar sort of situations occurred, similar things happened, and I also found it difficult to believe that the crew would continue to go on these dives given what they were experiencing down there, and given the dangers, and given, you know, how often they nearly lost members of their crew. Like, I just found it very difficult to believe that they would continue to put themselves in that danger, if that makes sense. I did much prefer the past timeline. I thought that that was very creepy, very atmospheric. That kept me on tenterhooks. I really wanted to find out more and to figure out what was going on, and it was just much more sort of atmospheric, the way things were described in that past timeline. So I found that to be much more creepy actually than the present timeline, which I wasn't expecting, because I thought I would enjoy the diving scenes more than the flashbacks, but it was actually the other way round for me. Yeah, I think part of my problem with this story is that I didn't particularly care for any of the main characters, so I didn't really feel particularly invested in the outcome of these dives, just because I didn't really gel with any of the characters. I didn't really care about any of the consequences, which is a little bit of a shame. But I also think that one of the main issues for me is that we find out fairly early on during these dives sort of what the threat is going to be to the dive team. We kind of know what direction this story is going in, what the horror elements are from a early stage, and I'm the kind of person where once I know what the thing is, what the threat is, it just becomes a obstacle that you need to overcome. It becomes a problem to be solved rather than something that is more scary, if that makes sense. I find things to be more unsettling, more disturbing, more scary when you don't quite know what it is yet, and that just makes my imagination run wild and it makes me much more frightened. But as soon as I kind of know what we're dealing with, it just becomes something that we need to solve. Does that make any sense? I think that's why I tend to prefer speculative horror and things where you're never quite sure what happens, maybe things that have a bit more of an open ending and are open to interpretation, or things that keep you guessing right until the very end. So yeah, it wasn't quite as good as what I thought it was going to be. When I started this book, I thought it was going to be a new favourite, but then yeah, I just started to lose interest. It did start to drag. So basically, if this was about 100 pages shorter, I think I would have really loved it. But yeah, that was my first introduction to this author, so I'm not sure how I feel. I do have quite a few more of her books that I'm hoping to pick up in the sort of spooky season, so I'm really hoping that perhaps some of the other ones have a little bit of a better pacing for me, but we shall see. Do let me know in the comment section if you have a recommendation of a Darcy Coates book that you think that I would enjoy, because I'd be really interested to know. But that brings me to the end of this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I feel like I've been a little bit rambly, a little bit waffly, so I hope I've made some kind of sense. But please do like this video if you did like it. Do subscribe if you want to see some more from me. Drop me a comment down below to let me know that you're here. I always love to chat with you in the comment section. And yeah, I'm wishing you all the best, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!